When you say we pay for it, that's not technically true. The idea that everybody who's paying into Medicaid paid for it and now they get out what they paid in is obviously not true. It is a redistributive program, and to pretend otherwise is just silly. The people who are paying the payroll taxes are not the people who are taking out through Medicaid, obviously.
Can I just address that super quick? So if we're talking about Medicare, right? Not Medicaid.
Right.
So in Medicare, so you're both correct and incorrect. So it's not like I put in $20 and I get $20 back. That part is true.
Right.
But we all pay into Medicare together, and then we all get it when we are sick.
Cenk Uygur went up against Ben Shapiro in a debate at Politicon about tax rates and healthcare and other issues. And no matter what you think of Cenk Uygur, he is fantastic, in my opinion, in debates like this with MAGA right-wingers like Ben Shapiro. This was a debate that I hadn't seen before, so I wanted to share it on the channel. This is the kind of thing we should be seeing on 24-hour news every day, but the 24-hour news doesn't want you to see debates like this, so I'm sharing it on my channel. We're going to take a look at some clips of this. Cenk Uygur, Ben Shapiro. I want to share my thoughts as well. Let's get into it together.
So can I ask you a question? I have two questions, really serious questions. One, what is your ideal tax rate? Because it's going to cost a lot of money for a lot of this stuff. And two, what is your ideal level of medical care? Because the fact is that we can spend millions of dollars on people at end of life care. We can spend millions of dollars on surgeries and preventative care. I mean, healthcare is an expensive business, even under a single payer system, which is why generally you end up with rationing. So what is your ideal level of healthcare that is provided to everyone, and what sort of tax rate are you proposing to subsidize that?
Yeah, so those are very, very fair questions. So let's talk about taxes for a second. So conservatives agree or say all the time that the golden era of America was the 1950s and 1960s. Well, there's a lot of truth to that. Our economy was booming at the time, and we became the #1 economy in the world at that time. The tax rate for the highest bracket fluctuated between 70 and 91%. So that is when we were at our best. Now, I want to be clear. I'm also a businessman, and boy, that seems high. It does, okay? And one of the reasons my family were Republicans when I was growing up was because before Reagan came in, the highest marginal tax rate was 70%. So now we are nowhere near that. We have reduced taxes to bare bones, and we have shifted the taxes onto the middle class and away from the rich and corporations. So there is a much better balance to be had. And if you said to me, well, you're going to have $800 in taxes that are new, I say, wow, that hurts. But you're going to save $1,000 in premiums, deal. That is a deal I will take every time because I can do math.
Okay.
So that is the beginning of your answer to taxes. And then you said how much care. Well, so that is something that all the countries that do single payer or a version of single payer struggle with, and they have learned a lot of lessons. And if we stop saying America's #1, we might actually just, first of all, on this issue, we're number 37. And if we looked at what Japan is doing so well, keeping costs down to half of ours and less, we might actually learn something from Japan, Switzerland, and other countries. And by the way, when we say Medicare for all, Medicare Advantage exists. So you can actually add private insurance on top of that, and I find that perfectly great. I have no problems with that at all. So that is the government making sure you don't die and actually lowering rates for you. And then if you want more insurance, no problem.
One thing that Cenk Uygur, I agree with the things that he's saying. One thing that he leaves out in his explanation of the marginal tax rates, you say marginal tax rates, and most people don't understand what that means. So when we're talking about the 50s or 60s or even up until the early 80s when Ronald Reagan was president, he's right, there was a top rate of between 70 and 91%. Well, people hear that and they think, okay, somebody at the top, somebody makes $1 million a year, and 700,000 of it or 900,000 of it goes to the government and they're left with $100,000. That's not how it works. They were taxed at a certain rate, probably 30, 35%, up until $2 million in today's dollars. So somebody up until $2 million, they were taxed at 30%, let's say. And then anything over $2 million, so $2,001,001, then that's that 70 or 90% rate. So it's not like the government was taking all of their money. We're not ever going to get back to those rates anytime soon, but like Cenk Uygur said, make America great again. A lot of the boomers when they felt the country was great was in the 50s and 60s, and we had a very high tax rate, and they probably didn't even know or don't even know that because they weren't at that top rate. So it's not as if we ever had wealthy people where 90% of their money was going to the government.
So all this sounds great, except for the fact that Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security eat up 66% of the federal budget every single year. The idea that all of these socialized medicine countries have it so much better than we do, particularly in terms of cancer care, is a joke. We are still number one in terms of 5-year cancer survival rate here in the United States. And when you talk about top marginal tax rates in the 1950s, there are a couple of things that are worth noting. One, that was top individual marginal tax rates, not necessarily the business tax rate. We now have some of the highest corporate tax rates altogether in the industrialized world. And if you
I want to stop here for just 1 second. Right-wingers like Ben Shapiro always bring up the corporate tax rates. Oh, it's the highest corporate tax rate in the world. On paper it is, but the corporations aren't actually paying that. You know, they could have you could say, oh, the corporate tax rate is 10 million%, but if they're not paying 10 million%, it doesn't really mean anything. So right-wingers bring up all the time. For large corporations, the average amount that they're paying in taxes is about 12%. And then you have some companies like Amazon who don't pay anything. But Ben Shapiro is not going to tell you this either. Back in that golden era of the 50s and 60s, corporations accounted for about 1/3 of all the taxes that were paid in the country. Now it's about 10% or a little bit less than 10%. So it's gone from 33% or so to 10%. So who makes up the difference when we're paying for $1 trillion defense budget and wars in the Middle East and all of that? Regular people like you and me. Ben Shapiro is never going to tell you that.
If you would prefer for us to destroy half of the world before we become the only country that didn't have its industrial capacity destroyed, which is what happened in the 1940s, leading to us being the only productive country on planet Earth, essentially, for the next 2 decades, I'm not with you there. I'm not really in favor of having a giant world war that destroys all industrial capacity across the West, so we're the only people who actually have the capacity to produce anything and just markets that we can provide to.
Right. So, first of all, it is fair to say that, of course, the 1950s and 60s were different. We'd just come out of the war. So, but you have to consider all the different factors. So one was that factor, and the other factor that was the one I mentioned. So when Republicans or conservatives say, well, high taxes by definition will lead to slower growth, well, we know because of our experience in the 1950s and 60s that isn't true. Now, you can say there are other factors, but you can't say that the highest marginal tax rate being 70 or even 90% slows down growth, because it didn't. And it wasn't in Japan and Switzerland, it was right here. And by the way, as a guy who grew up Republican, I was surprised by that too. I was surprised that Finland's system of non-competition in schools worked, but it does. So we have to be open to facts and understand. So, and on the issue of where we're good and not good in healthcare, sure, there are different areas where we excel. But Ben, honestly, you're cherry picking there one particular area that we're good. Overall, we're number 37. That is not a good result.
Well, you have
so
to break
we're
down
not
what that
dying
means.
from cancer, we're dying from other things. It's empirical. We are not as healthy. And finally, this idea that corporations are paying the highest tax rate is both, again, true and untrue. The part that it's true is, hey, there's a rate of 35%. The part that's not true is they don't actually pay that. There is giant loopholes. And they've got $2 trillion sitting offshore, and they won't bring it in. And the reality is that if you look at the taxes from the 1950s, corporations used to pay about a third of our taxes, about 33% of the taxes overall. So they did their fair share, and that is fair. I don't want them paying all of it, but I want them paying a reasonable amount. Now, the share that corporations pay of taxes is down to 10%. You see what they did there? They did wealth redistribution. They took your wealth and redistributed it to them.
Ben Shapiro makes the point that Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, these entitlement programs, right? We just increase, that's 66. We rely on them. We say, honestly,
Ben, I'll let you
that's what the vast majority of Americans want. They're enormously popular programs.
Okay.
Ben, I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, one more quick point, and then I'll be done with this because we can do healthcare for 8 hours here. But two things. One, I'd like to know which tax deduction, when people say tax loopholes, a tax loophole is just a tax deduction that's available to everyone, and some people take advantage of it and some people don't. I can't take advantage of certain corporate tax deductions because my business isn't in those businesses, for example. I'm sort of with you in the sense that I'm not in favor of tax deductions. I'm in favor of a lower tax rate and get rid of a lot of the tax deductions because I think that it's ridiculous that we have people gaming the system. That said, I'd like to know which tax deductions you'd like to do away with, and I'd like to know also when you say that corporations pay 10% of the taxes, right, and individuals pay the other 90%, okay, so that means the taxes are still getting paid to a higher rate than we ever have in our history in terms of the tax revenue to the government. The amount of tax revenue to the government right now is trillions of dollars every year. And final point here, you elided this question by saying we can learn stuff from Japan. The standard of care is the entire question when it comes to single-payer health care. That is the entire thing. If people felt like they were going to get the same access to care in a single-payer healthcare system as they did in a system where they can pay their own way, then we would have no controversy here. But the fact is that rationing is mandated as soon as you start having the government run the healthcare system and decide what level of care people get. So I don't want anyone deciding what level of care that I can get. I don't want anyone else to, they don't care about me. They don't know my child's name. They don't know my name. All they know is how much I cost. I mean, Ezekiel Emanuel's at least honest about this. Ezekiel Emanuel comes out and says, listen, I want to die at 70, right? I want to die at 80. That's fine with me. I'd rather die at that. Well, that's good for him. But if I don't want to die at 80, or I don't want my father to die at 80, it's none of his damn business.
So when you say tax revenue is at its highest point, now you know that that's misleading because everything economically is at its highest point, meaning that we have a lot more people in the country than we did in the 1950s and 60s, so hence we are collecting more overall taxes. But the reality is,
and a much bigger
as
economy.
A percentage, it is clearly down. The top bracket now is around 39%. It used to be at 91%. That's inarguable, right?
But our economy is significantly larger than it was then, and part of that is because of reductions in taxes over previous decades.
Well, we tried supply-side economics. Hey, Kansas, how's that working out for you? So there's this myth that...
It's working out for you. Your business is doing great.
Okay, yeah. Well, we just had 8 years of Obama. So the tax rate is clearly lower for the richest people in the country. It is clearly lower for corporations, in effect. It is, and so to say that it's a record collection is misleading. So in terms of the healthcare and how that relates to the government, oh, by the way, on one more thing on taxes, you said, name me a tax loophole. Mm-hmm. So yes, there are plenty of those. For example, they hide their money offshore. They do tricks like the double Dutch and the Irish sandwich or the reverse, and I would end that. I would say, hey, you know what? If we've got a 35% rate, here's the new rule. You're going to pay 35%, okay? And you're not allowed to hide your money. I don't care if it's in the Cayman Islands. We're going to make that illegal, Mitt Romney. We're going to make it illegal, okay? And so then every once in a while they do a tax holiday. Well, that must be nice. You remember when you got a tax holiday? I don't remember getting a tax holiday. No, that's only for corporations who bribe politicians. So they brought that rate down from 35% to 5%. And they said they were going to create more jobs. Color me surprised when it turns out they didn't. They offshore taxes. They took that 30% extra, put it in their pocket, gave it to their executives, and created no new jobs.
So Ben Shapiro's rebuttal to what I said, and Cenk Uygur actually was able to say directly to him about the corporate tax rates is, well, the corporations pay 10% and everybody else, the regular Americans, pay 90%. Who cares? So that gives you an idea of what Ben Shapiro thinks of you, just the average American, in comparison to what he thinks about corporations. Now, in terms of healthcare, he brings up the rationing. This is one of the things that right-wingers love to talk about. Oh, in these other countries, people wait to get their treatment and they die. I brought this up many times on my channel, but in my area, to see any kind of a specialist, it's a 6-month wait. You go to your primary care physician, they say, hey, let's do some tests, make sure you don't have cancer. We're going to send you to this specialist. And then you go to make an appointment with the specialist. Oh, we can see you in 2026. So I don't know, maybe in I live in a pretty rural area. Maybe in big cities, you just get in right away, but that's not the case here. And a couple of stories just from my own personal life. My mother, 10 years or so ago, was a Friday night. She went out, started having chest pains, went to the emergency room. She thinks she's having a heart attack, goes to the emergency room. They check her out. Couldn't find anything wrong with her. They do follow-up and all that kind of stuff. She gets a bill from the insurance, or she gets a bill from the hospital, and she talks to her insurance company. Oh, we're not going to pay that. Why? You didn't go to your primary care physician. So it's 8 or 9 o'clock on a Friday night. Her primary care physician's office is not open. She goes to the emergency room and the insurance is not going to pay because how is she supposed to get in touch with her primary care physician to be like, hey, Dr. So-and-so, I think I'm having a heart attack. Can you sign off on this while I'm going to the ER? Ridiculous. That's not rationing of care. And that's the problem to me in our system, part of the problem that we have right now. I don't care if the government pays for it or insurance pays for it, but we should just have coverage. Another personal story. This happened to me. Went to my primary care physician. Was having pain in my legs. She says, oh, I think maybe you have a circulation problem. Let's go and do some tests. Go and do some tests, get a bill. After my insurance had paid their portion, I had to pay $1,000. And guess what? Good news. The test didn't show anything. So I don't know what the problem was with my legs, but that test was perfectly fine. But I still had to pay $1,000 after my insurance paid for the test to tell me nothing. And, Ben Shapiro brings up all our cancer rates and all that. Sure. In the United States, if you need some kind of advanced laser brain surgery and you can afford to do it, the United States might be the best place for that. But just routine treatments and emergency room visits that for people in other countries are just covered by their taxes, people here in the United States have to essentially live in fear of those kind of issues. You see stories as an American, I see stories all the time where a friend of mine was a student in England and one of his American friends that he was in classes with fell and cut his arm on some glass. And they take him to the emergency room and he's terrified of what he's going to have to pay. And he's talking to all the different doctors and he's saying, oh, this is going to be so expensive. And all the doctors are all and nurses are all perplexed. They're just like, you're not going to have to pay anything. This is England. And it took a lot of convincing for this guy to understand that he wasn't going to be hit with thousands of dollars in medical bills. But that's the average American where they're afraid to travel in an ambulance to the emergency room because of how much it'll cost. So like I say, I don't care if it's the government, I don't care if it's insurance, but there are so many of us who feel like, what's the point in even having insurance? We pay every month for this, and then when we try to get treatment, the insurance companies are denying our claims or they only pay some small percentage. Seems like it would almost be better to just pay out of pocket. But this is the thing. Ben Shapiro doesn't care about any of this, whether American people are covered by insurance or their taxes, whether they live or die. He just wants a lower tax rate for himself. He wants a lower tax rate for corporations. If you get sick and you die and it's never covered, in Ben Shapiro's mind, who cares? But obviously this was an older debate because they're talking about Obama and Mitt Romney. Cenk Uygur brings them up in the debate there. These problems still haven't been solved many years later. These are debates that we should be having every day, every night on the 24-hour news. I remember when Bernie Sanders was running in 2020 on CNN, the supposedly liberal news network. Practically every day, they would have someone on to say, Medicare for all, how do you pay for it? Nobody wants this. It's too expensive. They never do that when they're talking about the next war. But when it's Medicare for all, nope, we don't have the money. We can't pay for it, which to me is insanity. But let me know who you think came out on top in the debate. Was it Cenk Uygur? Was it Ben Shapiro? Make sure to give me a like and subscribe. I'm Chris on Culture, and I will see you in the next video.